15.
Yes, I know you're not meant to have a script here, but I've got to have a few prompts just so I'm so intoxicated by the idea of these subjects that I need something to aid my concentration. I mean, I'm here under completely false, on false premises because I have actually no idea about either of these subjects. I didn't even Eleanor asked me the other day about would I like to come and do another 5:15? What really interests me? And I said, well, since you're asking, I suppose food and sex. And so yes, do it. So anyway, but look, here we are. Anyway, look, I was rather hoping you were all going to be sort of numbed into a state of sort of critical complacency by the time I talked. I'm rather anxious about being exposed to scrutiny so early in the evening. But anyway, no one's drunk quite enough wine yet. Can we have one of my slides, please? But we all know what we all know what wine does. This is a food product called Mega Pussy. I mean, wine, as Shakespeare said, giveth the desire, but taketh away the ability. And they're actually the neurologists, and I'm sure there are some neurologists amongst us this evening. Neurologists know that there's actually a reason for that. I mean, technically, when you drink wine, and this is a warning for all of you out there now, drinking wine, it reduces one of the most important sex hormones and diminishes the sense of touch. I mean, still, despite this depressing news, I mean, my own research in this area continues unabated. But the thing is, as I'm sure yours will in the course of the evening. Anyway, because wine obviously disinhibits, it's a great votary, as William James once said. It's a great votary of the yes function in man and woman. And so obviously, wine can be a very, very useful romantic accomplice. I mean, the knack, of course, in having wine as a romantic accomplice is to determine the exact geographical whereabouts of the frontier between creating an exciting state of interesting disinhibition and falling down in a terrible drunken heap. And as many of us know, this is a shifting frontier. We know also, don't we, that in thinking about food and sex, we know also that sort of that smell is very, very close to memory. But it's been my happy experience on several occasions to go on interesting wine tasting adventures in parts of France. And I remember my absolute favourite of these was in the grandest of claret houses, Chateau Aubryon, just outside Bordeaux. And there were lots and lots and lots of people there studiously sniffing and muttering and saying pious things about tobacco, berries, leather. Why wine can't taste of grapes, I've never understood. But anyway, that's besides the point. But there was one person there who's sniffing his classic glass of Aubryon, said, I think the best thing I've ever heard about as a wine descriptor, he said, I think I'm getting a little Brazilian woman. He didn't say whether his Brazilian woman was a slender, leggy thing from Copacabana Beach or a stunted little dwarf from the Mato Grosso. But anyway, it was. But there is no reliable link between smell and attraction, or at least so I've tragically found, or at least there isn't a symmetrical one. I mean, I'm not at all sure, for instance, that I'd like to that I'd find a woman who smelt of a ripe but delicious Vacherin terribly attractive, or indeed a woman who smelt of Burgundy. I mean, Burgundy, a famous wine merchant, once told me we should taste of farmyard, smell of farmyard. When that farmyard was, of course, a euphemism in this context. Instead, I think the connections between food and sex, and here we have the potato prick. The links between food and sex, I think, are probably elsewhere. We're much too sophisticated a group here in the Arts Club in Dover Street to make crude jokes about bananas. But many of us, and there'll be a photograph of this coming up in a moment, many of us are still terribly amused by the traditional champagne bowl is traditionally said to be based on the profile and shape of the breast of Marie Antoinette. When they had the dairy at Rambouillet decorated with erotic nurse, not dairy people. Anyway, Talleyrand. Anyway, back to while we're still in France. Talleyrand, never a hero of mine, but he did say something rather useful. I found that the very purposes of life is to give good dinners and to keep on fair terms with women. Now, these two things, of course, in any success of life can be reasonably well combined. There's the old thing, are you perhaps free for dinner? Now, we actually know what that means. That's an invitation whose offer and acceptance suggests much more than a mere session of eating. And this dinner thing I find is very, 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 very interesting. In a pattern that sort of anthropologists all recognise, the idea of the man hosting the woman at a dinner is a way of suggesting, and this traditional thing that the man, must be the provider. I mean, taking someone out to dinner suggests his potential as a source of wealth and wealth and nutrition and all the rest of it. But of course, for the female guest of the invitation, there is, of course, today a terrible moral dilemma. Yes, you accept an invitation to go out to dinner. You are engaging in an ancient transaction between I am the provider and you are the. But do you succumb just for the price of a cheeseburger, or should you, or should your stakes perhaps be higher? Anyway, but in food and sex, there's a fundamental thing that spotted Dick. In food and sex, notions of fertility are shared. The earliest works of art were of naked women, fertility goddesses. And the human brain, readily makes associations between the sense of well-being created by a good meal and the extensions of that same sense of well-being into other, possibly even more exciting territories. I love it, that when in his famous Elegy number 19 on his mistress going to bed, John Donne uses geographical metaphors to describe in his discovery of the female body. He actually, it really is literally geographical. He talks about Newfound land. Newfound land had just been discovered. It's generally a terra incognita. This is the famous poem where he talks about license my roving hands and let them go before, behind, between, above, below. Now, about the time John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's, was writing this, the word clitoris entered the English language, and with the same touching regard for geographical imagery. I mean, clitoris, of course, comes from the Greek word for little hill. But interestingly, I think fabulously interestingly, the current French slang for clitoris is praline, which are almond, of course, which confirms, at least in French culture, the fundamental connection between food and sex. Parents say to their children, "Don't play with your food." I mean, that's revealing again, I think, of another ambivalence with the connections here. And of course, the most harrowing thing of all about food and sex is the example of the praying mantis. And here, the freshly gratified female eats her partner. And we've all felt in that. We've all felt in similar circumstances, I'm sure. But here we are in Aphrodisiac territory. I mean, inevitably, this is a consequence of hearing here is an almond, for those of you who don't know what one looks like, or where to find one. We are in Aphrodisiac territory, and we have been since Aristotle. Aristotle recommended for sexual vitality you should live on a diet of fried sparrows' brains. I mean, the Romans, a little later, made a very direct connection between the eating of the genitals of animals, which they felt to be terribly randy, which meant in their case the ass, the wolf, and the deer, and a helpfully inflammatory effect. And actually, Chinese still believe this today. In the Kama Sutra, a dish of boiled asparagus and treacle in milk and ghee is recommended for maximum performance. But the best treatment of food and sex was by a great old, salacious old boy called Norman Douglas, who wrote a book called Venus in the Kitchen in 1952. And Norman Douglas, incidentally, was one of the great influences on Elizabeth David. He raided the larder of the classics. He writes recipes about snail, stuffed pig's head, leopard marrow, and he reproduces Apicius's famous vulvae sterilise, which is the womb of a pig stuffed with rue. Rue is that evergreen which has the properties of being an insect repellent and a remedy for sore eyes. But anyway, he notes also that a pie of bull's testicles was a favourite of Pope Pius V when he was feeling a bit under the weather. But in Venus in the Kitchen, Norman Douglas describes the craziest dish ever. It's called roti sans pareil, and what it is, you start off with an olive and you stuff it with an anchovy, and then you stick this in a beccafino, a bec figue, that little warbler. Then you put that into an ortolan, a boned ortolan. You put that into a boned lark. Then you put that into a boned thrush. Then you put that into a boned quail, into a boned lapwing, a golden plover, red-legged partridge, woodcock, teal, guinea fowl, duck fowl, pheasant, goose, turkey, bustard. And then you cook it for 25 hours or something, then you slice it. And Norman Douglas says this is the dish with the most rejuvenating effect. Bimbo sandwich. Oysters. Now, oysters, of course, have an associational rather than a directly chemical effect. Oysters, people always say oysters are great aphrodisiacs. That's not scientifically certain. But it's associated, I mean, that big question in aesthetics is, do we get pleasure from the direct effect of things, objects, buildings, food, or from the associations? I think in oysters, it's probably from the associations. You have to prise an oyster open to reveal a delicious secret, which then becomes sort of soft and yielding. There's a ritual involved, an expensive ritual usually, and of course an intense pleasure. Roly Lee, the great cook at Café Anglais, always insists that part of the fun of oysters is something to do with the salt. And we actually, it's technically interesting because we actually, during moments of high passion, excitement, or danger, we actually do secrete salt, rather than sugar. Now, anyway, being in a place which has a fine restaurant, I haven't actually checked the dish of the day tonight, but there's another ambiguity in dish of the day, which shows that another profound link between food and sex. You've got to remember when you're out to dinner later that any menu is a terrible, terrible, terrible minefield. Fish and chips, for instance. Fish and chips, this is an invitation to the most appalling forms of sexual indulgence. Fish is positively venereal. Fish comes out of the ocean, and Venus herself, Venus, the goddess of love, was born in the sea. Even potatoes. Because potatoes were once exotic, they were thought to be terribly, terribly exciting. In fact, the playwright John Fletcher, The Night of the Burning Pestle chap, says, a potato will advance your withered state. Fill your honour with noble itches. And I look forward to, we all indeed look forward to be filled with noble itches a little later perhaps. Onions. Here's another terrible invitation to lust and venery. In The Perfumed Garden, we read that Sheikh Nefzawi managed to sustain an erection lasting for 30 days on a diet of onions alone. Tomatoes originally known as the pomme d'amour, the apples of love. Chocolate, like sex itself, chocolate produces dopamine. That may be one account of the famous Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull Mars bar story, but there are alternatives. And then there are, of course, all the similes of food and sex. All the poets go on about breasts like lemons. I've never heard a bottom described like a coconut, but on the other hand, you never know. The great poet, Robert Herrick, his Julia, the person to whom Robert Herrick was always using sort of vegetable and fruit metaphors, and gastronomic metaphors. Herrick's Julia had legs, white and hairless as an egg. How cool is that? Anyway, just one more thing, as the great late cock-flavoured chips, the crisps, it's on the menu later, perhaps. Just one more thing, as the great late Steve Jobs used to say in his Apple presentations. And Steve Jobs also used to say another thing. He said, that Steve Jobs was responsible for all these gorgeous, utterly, this is Marie Antoinette's breast, the design of Apple computers. He said, you know a design of a computer or one of these appliances, you know it's good when you want to lick it. And he was so right. Great design. Sort of meant to be my subject. Great design is all about. It's all about that. It's about sensuous response to things, about an intellectual response to things, but also one flavoured by sensuousness. Taste is both a sense and a metaphor, which reminds me of the one very, very last thing when it comes to. Dinner, I think I probably really must, and thinking concepts of licking, I really must remember to order praline ice cream. Thank you.